US national debt buyers are disappearing. The percentage of how many foreign buyers there are of newly issued US debts has declined from 71% all the way down to 14%. And this when we are soon hitting 40 trillion US dollars in national debt. And at the same time, we're talking about a strategic Bitcoin reserve. A sovereign nation is accepting Bitcoin payments for oil, and we're getting overall a lot more merchant adoption. And with that, the dollar endgame is no longer a wet dream of Bitcoiners. It's a reality unfolding in front of us. But there will be one deciding question, a fork in the road, if we choose Bitcoin as freedom money or if we choose stablecoins and CBDCs. You can choose between Bitcoin and your digital cage. And this is what we are going to talk about today with Roberto Rios, one of the experts when it comes to macro. Enjoy. Why are you excited about Bitcoin right now?
Bitcoin right now is, I think, at a really interesting point because there are some forces converging that I think are going to shape the next, 5 to 10 years of how this, whole cycle plays out.
Yeah, and I definitely want to get into that. You also mentioned Japan. I also want to talk about general the US dollar, how you're seeing things. But what are the forces that you're seeing for Bitcoin?
Well, so there's a couple ones, right? The first would be the institutionalization, right? In January of 2024, we had the launch of several, major ETFs, which was followed up by a couple more later that quarter, which were the first, professional grade equity products that weren't a single stock that could actually custody Bitcoin, right? And that led to a huge wave of, you could call it I would say, Bitcoiner adjacent adoption of Bitcoin as a store of value, which means that people who wouldn't necessarily buy Bitcoin, think about a 65-year-old guy with a 401k or a 48-year-old, dad of three. He doesn't have the time or the energy to research Bitcoin or to do self-custody or to understand it, but he's heard about it. Maybe he believes some of them, there's some problem with our monetary system and he wants to have a hedge against that. Those kinds of investors all started piling into the ETFs, which caused obviously the BlackRock ETF to have the highest amount of monthly flows of any ETF in history, and it was the first ETF to reach 1 billion AUM in under 60 days. So faster than the gold ETF, faster than even tech ETFs. It was a huge gold rush, right, into Bitcoin. But that has, that institutionalization and then further commodification of Bitcoin has started to introduce some, unique variables, we could say, right? So one of them is, and this is something that a lot of people have been pointing to, obviously, is that a lot of retail demand is being rerouted. So instead of people buying actual Bitcoin and self-custodying and learning about how the protocol works, they're just buying an ETF. And they think that the ETF is a good enough proxy, and the ETF has reserves, right? And they're audited. And so, okay, for the most part. But the problem is you're obviously still relying on a centralized counterparty. And the entire point of Bitcoin is to get away from that, right? Is to understand the risks of centralization and what centralization in our financial system did in 2008 and 2020, and why that is a fundamental tenet of the fiat system and why that should be avoided, right? So in the last 2 years, I'd say there's been a significant amount of buying pressure that's been diverted away from Bitcoin and just into ETF products. And then, of course, as Seyr has continued his treasurification of Bitcoin and other copycats have popped up, there's emerged a whole class of, again, Bitcoin adjacent investors who are just interested in stocks, in Bitcoin stocks. So whether that's miners, whether that's the treasury companies, whether that's the equity and equity derivative products. So think about STRC. There's MSTY, right? There's leveraged MSTR ETFs. I know that in February of this year, Grayscale applied for a covered call option ETF on MSTR stock. So that's another layer of derivatization, commodification of Bitcoin. And so that, unfortunately, right, it's a blessing and a curse, right? Because on one hand, you're entrenching Bitcoin more deeply into Wall Street, making it harder and harder and harder for the incumbent, financial system to actually like try to get rid of it. Like, let's say, God forbid, there's a 6102 order. Now you have all these entrenched interests on the side of Bitcoin who would fight that, right? And these interests are very powerful, right? They would fight on the side of allowing people to own and buy and sell Bitcoin because they need the liquidity in the market in order to, provide enough liquidity for their equity and derivative products. But on the other side, like I said earlier, it's directing value and attention and overall buying pressure away from Bitcoin as a fundamental asset. So it's that double-edged sword, which is causing like, what I think is like a potential future to open up where Bitcoin self-custody becomes you could say the exception rather than the norm. And most people just own Bitcoin as a, financial derivative. So they own an equity, they own an ETF, they own an option on an MSTR ETF, whatever it is. But they never actually own the underlying, which I think opens us up to the same problem that gold's faced for the last, 50 years in commodity markets.
Yeah, it's really it's really, how to frame that. It's interesting to see because we have on the one hand, of course, the saying that like it's kind of like not, you cannot stop it. Like people will do with Bitcoin things that they think they will benefit from. So a BlackRock coming in and offering an ETF is a no-brainer because they have a lot of clients and they want Bitcoin, and if they offer Bitcoin, they make a lot of fees. I think also strategy. Even if Seyr wouldn't have discovered Bitcoin, some other guy would have come and would have probably tried the same thing as Seyr. And so it's inevitable that something like that would have happened even if Seyr wouldn't have done it. Probably the tense was wrong here, but I don't care. So the question is, will Bitcoin really suffer from that? Is that a bad thing if there's only a small amount of people doing self-custody, or is it only bad for the people that interact with the Bitcoin ETFs and the strategies and the treasury companies and all of those, and people in Bitcoiners in self-custody are basically like they don't have to care what strategy is doing or what BlackRock is doing?
That's a good question, and that's what I think we're gonna have to answer over the next 5 to 10 years. But so here's the way I see it, right? Bitcoin is already going to face a headwind no matter what, and this is something that Bitcoiners don't like to admit, but it's something that's true if you study monetary economics. There's something called Gresham's law, and Gresham's law was actually found by a British banker, a guy who was an advisor to Queen Elizabeth. And what he noticed is that in this Elizabethan England, the government would have a bimetallic standard. They'd set prices and weights of each currency, right? So silver was let's say £2, £2 per ounce, and gold was £30 per ounce, right? So a ratio of 15 to 1. The problem is if the actual free market rate was different than the government set rate, then one currency would be overvalued and one currency would be undervalued, right? So, let's say silver could be undervalued, which means, you can buy it on the black market or on like a free market rate of, let's say £1, and then you could sell it back to the government at £2. So you'd make a profit. And in that kind of bimetallic currency system, what he found is that the undervalued currency was always hoarded and the overvalued currency was always spent. So, it would fluctuate throughout the years, but, some years gold would be, undervalued. And so it would be hoarded, and some years silver would be undervalued. And so that would be hoarded, right? And the other one was spent. The same is true with Bitcoin and the modern fiat standard, right? Bitcoin is a superior store of value to basically any other form of money that's ever been created. But the problem is that now that creates a dilemma because now investors and people who buy Bitcoin now see it as a investment asset, right? As a store of value asset rather than an actual spendable money. Because why would you spend something that's gaining 20% CAGR for the last 10 years when you could spend your fiat, which is losing 2 to 5% a year? It doesn't make any sense to hoard your fiat. It makes all the sense in the world to spend all the fiat you have and then to buy as much Bitcoin you have, right? And save it. But what that means is that Bitcoin is now being hoarded. The monetary velocity of Bitcoin is falling, and it's not being used as an actual money, as a currency, right? People aren't going and spending their Bitcoin on buying meals, buying gas, buying houses, right? Buying stocks, even. Like, how many stocks can outperform Bitcoin? Very, very few. So in that environment, Bitcoin becomes hoarded. Bitcoin becomes much more of a store of value than an actual medium of exchange. And I do believe it'll pass through this, this filter, right? It has to go through the 3 layers of money. First, the store of value, then the medium of exchange, and then the unit of account. But the problem is, like, there may be many, many years between those things. And if most people want, like, what we want to see, obviously, with Bitcoin is the creation of a circular economy that's completely separate from the incumbent fiat system. That can only happen if Bitcoin overcomes Gresham's law. And the only way we overcome Gresham's law is, realistically, is if the fiat system fails badly enough and quickly enough that everyone is forced to adopt a new monetary standard. Because under the old, fiscal playbook of, let's say, the 1940s, like Lynn Alden points out, or even the 1970s, right? Government puts inflation at 5 to 10%. They pin rates at 2%, and they burn out all the savers slowly over time. And at that rate, at that delta, right, an 8% negative real rate over, let's say, 20 years, the debt can be cut in half in real terms, right? And so that's very favorable for governments after wars, right? After huge inflationary spending binges, like, they love to do this. They love to go out and say, okay, we're going to be doing, financial repression, low interest rates, high inflation. Everyone's going to be burned out over time, but it's going to be spread out over 20 years. So you won't see all the pain in 1 year. It'll be slowly. And so most people won't even realize it's happening, right? In that environment, Bitcoin faces a major issue because, again, fiat's burning at 8% a year in real terms, and the Bitcoin's gaining 20% a year in real terms. And so everyone buys Bitcoin. Sure, the price goes up, number go up. Yay, we're all so happy, but nobody spends it. And so the circular economy that we want to develop never develops. And the problem that I see is that, this commodification of Bitcoin, right? The ETF products, the equity products, the Seyr products, all the stuff we talked about, that's fostering that first scenario. That's fostering the number go up. Everyone treats it as a store of value, but no one actually uses it. Nobody actually builds the circular economy, right? All the apps, all the, the Lightning nodes and all the, Lightning wallets that, need to survive on a couple sats fees. They all have very low revenue in those scenarios because nobody's using them, because there's not enough monetary velocity to facilitate trade.
What role does volatility play in that? Like in like Bitcoin being used as money?
So volatility is generally bad for a money, right? Which is why you could argue that the more volatile Bitcoin is, the earlier it is in its evolution towards becoming a true money, right? Volatility is very good for a store of value in terms of its relation to inflation. So, for example, let's say inflation goes up 2%. If your store of value goes up 5%, that's a good thing. You want that, right? If your volatility, though, in absolute terms is extremely high, very few people want to use that as money. And that can be seen by, Weimar Germany, the Venezuelan Bolivar, right? All these hyperinflationary currencies that dealt with huge, volatile price swings in the price of everything eventually just cease to be used as money because it's impossible to price things out when the rate of change is so fast that, let's say, your grocery store prices are changing 30% a week, either up or down. And so that will cause uncertainty, instability, and eventually a loss of the, network effect that most monies profit from. So right now, obviously, I think we're still early. I wouldn't say we're in the first innings because Bitcoin has made a lot of progress and it's much less volatile than it was in, say, 2013. But it's still volatile. right? On absolute terms, we'd want to get to a place where Bitcoin fluctuates at most 5 to 10% a year, right? And that I think is still maybe a decade off.
We Bitcoiners always preach not your keys, not your coins, but we're giving away all our data to the big tech servers. Your passwords, your identity, your accounts. That's why I personally switched away and started using Proton Pass. Everything is end-to-end encrypted, so not Proton and not anyone else can read your data. And look how simple this is. I just click here once on the login button and I automatically get the passkey sign-in from Proton. With just one click on it, I'm signed in. And of course, it also stores all the two-factor authentication codes. And if my credentials ever show up in a data breach, it warns me so I can act very fast. If you care about holding your own Bitcoin, you should also care about holding the control of your own data. It's the same fight. And the best part is you're not sacrificing your convenience. It's privacy and security by default. And you can start for free right now. And if you want to upgrade to Proton Plus, you get that for just $1 for your first month. Link is in the description and in the pinned comment down below. So go to proton.me/pass/Robin Seyr. Make sure you close your digital front door. It takes you 5 minutes and €0 to start with. Again, that's proton.me/pass/Robin Seyr. Yeah, that's kind of how I also think about it, because I think more than the merchant adoption, more than Gresham's law, I personally don't spend Bitcoin too much and hold it as cash because of the volatility. Because if you have the next 6 months freelancers to pay, family for family that you provide for, you want the money that you use for those 6 months to not lose value. And so with Bitcoin, I love it over 4, 5, 10 years. But over 6 to 12 months, it's really hard, because we can try to predict where it is in 12 months, but we don't really know. And Bitcoin always humbles us in like not doing what it's supposed to do. And so it's really bad for me in holding it for even short period of time, like a few weeks or a few months. And it's really great for years to come, because the volatility kind of like smooths out, because over time it just goes up. And so so that's what I'm thinking of. Like, we want Bitcoin as money, we want to spend it, we want to come away from fiat, but maybe we just need to be patient the next 20 years in order for Bitcoin actually to succeed there. But then there's this danger in this middle zone that the same thing happens with gold, that there's those institutions coming in and realizing people don't like the volatility. Let's get all the Bitcoin, let's smooth out the volatility and give them some token. I mean, that's stretch. Now, the first 12 months, they have been some months more successful than other months. Right now, it looks horrible for them. Just 2 months ago, it looked really good for them. So let's see how this shakes out, because it has to be successful in order for people to adopt it. But it's a really difficult discussion of like, will we get to this 10, 20 year space where people use it as money because it's less volatile, or like almost no volatility in real purchasing power, where we can spend it. Because like, I would love to just be on Bitcoin if it wouldn't be downside. The Gresham's law, I don't care. I know it's real and I know it's amazing, but I don't care personally too much about it, because people always say, oh yeah, like I'd rather spend the fiat. But what if I don't have to hold fiat in the first place? Because if in order for me to spend something, I have to hold it also. And so I'd rather just like hold 100% of Bitcoin. And for me, the volatility is the thing of like, oh shit, I need some kind of cash buffer for the next like 3 months to have. I don't really have a question on that. I just like, I'm really confused always with like how we progress in Bitcoin and what is now good or bad for Bitcoin in that term.
Yeah, I think I think the real edge that Bitcoin has, and this is something I've talked about before, is that it perfectly can invert uh, the failing fiat system. So what do I mean by that? Okay, so in 2015, Luke Gromen notes that on net, global central banks stopped buying U.S. Treasuries, right? Now, certain specific banks, like the Bank of Japan, were still buying a ton of U.S. Treasuries, but on net, the entire global system basically had been financing, a ton of U.S. Treasury issuance. And in fact, in my book, Dollar Endgame, which I have, over here, um, I note that from 2008 to 2015, there was an increase of about $8 trillion in federal debt, and foreigners bought 71% of it. So a majority of new net debt issuance was financed by foreigners. And then from 2015 to 2022, um, which December 2022 is when the book was released, foreigners bought, there's around $10 trillion of new debt in 7 years, and foreigners bought 14% of it. So on net, foreigners went from the largest buyer of new debt to one of the smallest. And the reasons for that are complex, right? There's multivariate. Obviously, I don't think the dollar is going to die tomorrow, but I think the appetite for long-term debt, when a sovereign, when a foreign country, when Switzerland, when Poland, when Russia looks at the U.S. fiscal trajectory and 39 trillion in debt and 1.2 trillion a year in interest payments, and the interest payments are growing, 15% annualized year over year, and the GDP grows at 1.2% year over year. It's a pretty clear analysis to be like, okay, this is unsustainable. I'm not going to buy the long-term debt of this country. But that obviously starts with the very ultra long-term debt, and it moves up the curve, right? And so where Bitcoin has a potential to, you could say usurp the dollar is not necessarily in like dollar-based trade, like, cash trade today. The first place it has opportunity to win is in the treasury market, especially the long-term bonds. And again, you think about like, why would a central bank hold, you know, 30-year U.S. Treasuries, 20-year U.S. Treasuries, 10-year U.S. Treasuries? Because they know that they need a liquid medium of exchange so they can trade for things. So if they need to do a foreign currency intervention, if they need to do domestic bailout of their banking system, right? Whatever they did need to do, they need something liquid. But then two, they need something they can store that liquidity in, right? That will hopefully gain value over time, that will give them some interest. Now, in real terms, for many decades, that was bonds, right? From 1982 to 2015, bonds in real terms had a huge bull market, right? We saw interest rates go from 18, 19%, even on the short end, down to zero. And so if you're a bondholder, that means for the better part of 25 years, you're winning every single year. You're making money, and you have interest on the coupon that you're collecting, right? So not only is a bond price going up, in real terms, in terms of its like par, price to par value, it's going up because you're getting interest and inflation was low. But now we're entering a paradigm where inflation's running hot globally. There's a scramble for, world superpower, a jostling of world superpowers. We have wars, open wars in Ukraine, the Middle East, right? The Iran war is right now in another, 60-day peace deal, but that might fall through, right? It's contingent on several things that Iran has to agree to, one of which being dismantling all nuclear weapons programs, which they, don't want to do. And that that environment, right, fosters uncertainty, which fosters mistrust and especially long-term U.S. debt. And so where Bitcoin has an opportunity here is not right now replacing the U.S. dollar, but replacing the U.S. Treasury bond. And if sovereign countries, right, if foreign central banks or foreign, large sovereign wealth funds or high net worth individuals start seeing this play out and start buying Bitcoin, that can be a huge boon to, the price, obviously, but also to adoption. I'm sure you saw the news article back in March where Iran started demanding payment in Bitcoin for the oil tankers, right? And they were estimating, around $20 million a day in collected Bitcoin fees. that's just one example of, right, one of Bitcoin's use cases for a sovereign that's in a war that has financial restrictions against it. It can now use an alternate financial system that doesn't have any, middleman, no central government to censor you. If that idea starts to catch on, right, you could see Bitcoin adoption, at least at the treasury level, go global. And I think that is something that would accelerate us much closer to where we need to be in terms of the global adoption picture.
Is something like a strategic reserve for sovereigns, which basically is kind of what we are talking about also for the USA. There are people that say like 4th of July is something coming for Independence Day. I'm not sure about it. It's coming. I think when this comes out, the 4th of July will already be happened. I think this comes probably out 5th of July, so it will be fun to see that. But do you think sovereigns actually not only like accepting it as a payment, but also like really buying it and like storing it themselves? And because the world is uncertain and people no longer trust in the treasuries, no longer trust in the currencies, they're like, hey, we don't trust you, we don't trust you, we don't trust you. They need something that they don't have to trust, and Bitcoin is literally the only thing they can really do except of gold, but gold they're already kind of doing.
Yeah, I think that's accurate, right? I think they're going to be dragged there kicking and screaming for the most part, right? The problem is like central bank and like foreign central banks, governments, right? They want a monetary system they can control, right? Which is why they love the fiat system. Not only can they tax you, can they inflate the money away, but they have insight into basically all major transactions that happen within, their borders, right? They can subpoena a bank and be like, hey, I need all the records on what this person did. They're all KYC'd. Okay, like Robin, let's find out how much money he exactly makes. How much is he spending? How many accounts are linked to him, right? And obviously there's ways around that. You can use cash. You can use, P2P networks, but it's very censored, right? It's very monitored, right? But the problem is obviously as the world we're moving into, the US Treasury is no longer the de facto standard of store of value for the long run, right? It's increasingly becoming precarious to hold US Treasuries. And that was seen obviously in the initiation of war by Russia in 2022 and then the subsequent censoring of their reserves, right? The freezing of the Russian reserves. That was the first time in modern, at least in the last, 15, 20 years, that the US had actually weaponized their monetization of the financial system, right? They'd weaponized their control over SWIFT, over the international banking cabal. They'd weaponized their ability to use, correspondent banks in the US so that a foreign government could not access its own money. And that was the first step that was like a slap in the face of every central bank. It's like, oh, you love having control over your money. You think that these US treasuries are as good as cash and that you can go spend that cash however you want, whenever you want. Actually, no, you can't. It depends on you agreeing with the US and towing the line. And if you don't, we're going to cut you out of the system. We're going to freeze all your stuff and take it for us. And so that that threat has now caused you could say a global gold rush. So all these central banks, right, like rushing into gold, rushing into silver. Global central bank gold buying has been above 1,000 tons annually for the last 4 years. Again, since 2022, largely because of this Russian war freezing of reserves. And central banks like gold because obviously it's more centralized, more censorable, right? Especially in large quantities, much easier to track. But the problem is obviously gold presents the same problem that we've always dealt with, which is a centralized assets backed by a fiat fractional currency. And it just repeats the same issue of inflation, deflation, boom, bust, collapse over and over and over and over again, right? And that gold, which is it is liquid, is very hard to move. And in a digital economy where you need to make balance of trade payments, you need to be able to settle invoices within a couple hours. I don't see that happening with gold, right? I don't see how a South Korean, electronics manufacturer can settle up with a Norwegian, oil producer within a few hours with the gold standard. Like, it's just not possible, right? The speed of trade today, the velocity of trade, this worked in the 1800s, sure. But like today, with how fast things move and how many times, you need to turn over your inventory and your accounts receivable and just in time delivery from manufacturers, there's no way that they can withstand a monetary system that's on a gold standard again. So I think that Bitcoin will be inevitable, right? And the governments will not want to adopt it, but they'll be forced to. Now, the question is, like, will they be able to co-opt it? And that's what I'm more worried about, right? Will they make a Bitcoin strategic reserve, buy a bunch of Bitcoin, buy a couple 100,000, and then create a fractional currency based off of Bitcoin, right? They create let's say the Chinese Bitcoin stablecoin, or they'll create basically like the new euro dollar, but a euro dollar for Bitcoin. So it'll be like you get the stable coin and it's good for 100 sats, and you just have to trust that the government has 100 sats or 1,000 sats or whatever it is to back that stable coin. And then you spend that in your wallet and you can trade and buy and sell with it. But that wallet, obviously on a stablecoin rail, is all monitored and watched by a centralized entity.
It's so interesting because when you think about gold, and gold has a great performance actually price-wise also the last like 10 years especially, mostly because of the last like 2 years or 1 year actually, because it had a huge run. When I thought about it, I was thinking about how you can still use gold, and gold is basically you can still do all the things that you can do with gold than you could do before with gold, just that nobody accepts it as a currency. And so the worst case, in my opinion, for Bitcoin, and I'm curious what you think about it, is that most people don't care about Bitcoin. Most people just want some token that the government approves of, and they use that. They have the Apple Pay. Under the Apple Pay is some government token. Under the government token is some treasury or whatever. And then underneath somewhere are some Bitcoin, but they're not connected at all to the actual currency. So if that happens, you as a Bitcoiner, having Bitcoin in self-custody, you probably benefit, except that you can't use it as money. So you still benefit from the number graph technology, from like it being a great asset, from freedom perspective, from all the things that we want it to be. And there are already places now that accept Bitcoin. So I'm fairly certain that even if we have a fiat currency that is supported by Bitcoin, that there will also be merchants that accept Bitcoin. I mean, now Bitcoin is really a bad immediate exchange because of the fees, because of the tax rules, because of the volatility and all of those things. And still there are merchants in every big city that accept Bitcoin, and people actually use that, not as much as we want to, but I'm amazed how much we actually use Bitcoin, given how bad of a regulatory framework we have, how bad of a volatility it has, and all of those things. So for me, that's the worst case situation for Bitcoin. But better would be if we don't end up there at all. And I'm not sure where we go and how we can even, like, I'm not sure if we can move the needle. You know what I mean? It's like we have to trust that human nature is critical and thinks about the decision they're doing. But all the evidence that we have so far is like they might not.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, no, I think that is a good concern, because, and this is something I've thought about before too, right? Like, let's say Saylor's talked about 21 million a coin in 20 years, 21 years. We've heard price targets of $10 million right before, 1 million, obviously. If you ask most Bitcoiners, right, let's say the government tomorrow set the price of Bitcoin at $10 million. But in order to get a $10 million price, which is obviously a huge delta from the market price right now, you turn in your Bitcoin to a government account, right? And in return, you get 10 million stable coins that are supposedly backed by your Bitcoin. Do you think most people would do it? I think a lot of people would, unfortunately, right? I think a lot of Bitcoiners wouldn't, obviously, but there's a significant portion of Bitcoiners that are just in it for number go up. And those people who don't care about the freedom aspect, who don't care about the censorship resistance, those people would trade in their Bitcoin. Those people would go for it. And that creates an environment where, right, I know this sounds kind of bad, but like as Bitcoiners, we're kind of rooting for the collapse of the fiat system, because the stronger the incumbent fiat system is, right, the more network effect it has, the lower the inflation, the longer they play this game out, right? The longer that they tax us slightly via inflation, tax us via QE, pump up asset prices benefiting the rich, bail out their friends, the longer they're able to perpetuate this game. If it's like a Band-Aid, right? If you rip it off and it hurts really bad for a short time and then it's done, that's an environment where Bitcoin actually has a huge edge, because in a failing fiat system, right, in Venezuela, in Weimar Germany, almost anything became used as money, right? If you do a study of Weimar Germany, like when money dies, there were wheelbarrows of cash being used as firewood, right, and they were being used as a shredding paper for factory mills, literal 100,000 note Reichmark bills, right? Huge amounts of currency just being destroyed in real time. The printing was so rampant that they ran out of ink at the money printer facilities, and they had to only print on one side. So you'd get a Reichsmark and it'd only be showing the Reichsmark on one side, the other side would be blank. In that environment, anything is money. Everything is money, right? Cigarettes were money. In Zimbabwe in 2008, when they had their hyperinflation, people were using these fuel coupons that were handed out by the government that were good for 1 liter of fuel. Those became the new monetary standard, and people were trading fuel coupons for food, right? For medical services, for housing, for rent, whatever. In that environment, Bitcoin is not only like strong, it's inevitable, right? In that environment, Bitcoin becomes ubiquitous. Everybody uses Bitcoin because they're running from the fiat system collapsing. But again, that requires, right, not only the gravitational attraction of Bitcoin, right, the superior store of value, right, the hard cap, the censorship resistance. Anyone can open a wallet. Anyone can run a node. Anybody can mine Bitcoin, right? That total flat decentralized architecture allows everyone. That's an attractive quality, right? But you also need the repellent quality of the incumbent system failing, because you have to get people off the old thing and into the new thing. And most people, unfortunately, will not do that without pain, right? They might like this, like a few people like us, the Bitcoiners, like the positives of Bitcoin so much, we're going off the fiat standard. But most people who aren't educated on Bitcoin, aren't educated on sound money, aren't educated on Austrian economics, they all say, well, man, I have to open up an exchange account and buy some Bitcoin. I have to buy a hardware wallet. I have to figure out how to self-custody, right? Oh, I want to run my own node. I have to buy a Raspberry Pi. Oh, I want to run a miner. Man, I have to figure out where to get all that energy, and I have to like set up the electricity for it. Man, that sounds like a lot of work. I'll just buy my S&P 500 ETF and go watch Love Island, right? That's what most people think. So you need both forces at play. And so that's why most Bitcoin, like that's why actually one of the best scenarios for Bitcoin is the worst scenario for fiat. We want to see the hyperinflation event. We want to see the debt collapse, right? We want to see the stock market go down 80% and the Fed panic and do massive QE, and then everybody starts to flee the dollar, or everybody starts to flee the euro, right? Because that is what will actually bring users into Bitcoin that, especially if the collapse is bad enough, will actually start trading and buying and selling and exchanging Bitcoin as an actual base money. And that is where you see a complete, you could say like hyper Bitcoinization of the financial system, right? Bitcoin becomes, the flywheel effect of Bitcoin starts, and just like the dollar right after World War II, how it started to overtake the British pound as a global reserve currency, Bitcoin gains this flywheel effect, gains this momentum. And before you know it, country after country after country after country is adopting it. All these sovereigns are buying it. All these high net worth individuals are hoarding it, trying to buy as much as they can. Everyone's trying to use it to buy and sell, cars, food, gas, everything.
Yeah, it's a it's a spiral. Like once we, and it's a fiat currency, because like fiat currency is like 100% based on trust, and once you kind of like get rid of that trust, like something triggers, and we have seen that, and in Argentina and many different countries, it can go really quick that a currency is gone. The only thing that I'm always seeing is like they just come up with a new stuff, and like people then trust the new, and I'm like, how? Like you, Argentina is a great example because it happened like so many times after another, and then like they just changed the name, just did some new things, and the new people trust, and the people trusted the new thing, and then like 13 years later, the same thing happened all over again. They trusted it again. Now they are right now in a little bit of a different spot. Let's see how it shakes out. But like the history was like the currency collapsed, they come with a new one, and they go on. Currency collapse, they come with a new one, and they go on. Where I'm thinking like, if you live in that country, don't you see that like that's BS? Like why does anyone trust it? Because people have to trust it, obviously. Otherwise, if nobody holds it, nobody does anything, it has no value. The government can't do anything against that. They can write as many laws as they want. If the people don't trust it, there will be a new guy voted in. Like it's like it will not work. So it's the argument of like, oh, like government forces on us. It's like, yeah, a little bit. But if nobody accepts it, and all emergency no to it, at some point the government is like, oh shit, we have to do something because we're not getting elected. We're like, I don't know, like it's hard for me to wrap my head. The more I'm into Bitcoin, the more I realize how freaking strong the network effect of fiat is, and how less critical thinking people really are.
Yeah, exactly. And that's again part of the problem. That's why I said like for Bitcoin to really gain value and really gain adoption, we need to see not only the attractive effect of Bitcoin, but we need to see the repellent effect of a failing fiat system, right? It's that old like thought experiment where you take a frog and you know if you throw it in boiling water, it'll immediately jump out, right? If you put a frog in water and you slowly bring it to a boil, it will stay there until it dies, right? Because the price of change, especially when that change is happening too gradually, you start to get accommodated to it, right? You get acclimated to it. Oh, well, inflation's 2% this year. Well, that's not too bad. That's only a little bit worse than it was last year. Oh, it's up 4.5% this year, 5%, but hey, it's not that bad. Last year was already 2%. Oh, it's 20% this year, but last year was 5%. It's not that big of a jump. I guess it is what it is. And over time, right, you basically psychologically condition a populace to accept certain precepts, right? They accept that inflation is constant. You look at the economics field, right? Like I studied finance and economics in college. It's part of my degree. And uh one of the precepts was that inflation was good, right? One of the things that they took as a given was 2% inflation is good. And I remember I asked the teacher, and of course this got me in horrible trouble. Like he did not like this, and I was not his favorite student after this. But I said, if 2% inflation is good, then 4% inflation is better. 10% inflation is even better. Like, why stop at 2? I don't understand that. Like, if 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 you can go down that road, right, and you can't tell me that there's any downside to inflation, which is the argument he was making. I'm like, if you can at least tell me there's a couple downsides, and then okay, the risk reward, right, the balance starts to tip at 5%, 10%, maybe you can make that argument. They were all telling me that inflation's like universally a good thing, universally good for spending, boosts aggregate demand, right? All the Keynesian word slop. And I was like, so 10%. Why doesn't the Fed run it at 10? Why don't we run it at 20? Why not 100? Like, that's better. You know how fast people would be spending money if inflation was 100? But again, people were everyone in the class was like shocked that I was asking the teacher these questions because they had been conditioned that 2% inflation was good and that was the law. And you just had to shut up and take that and understand it and move on with your life, right? And so that's the same thing that happens with all these fiat systems, with Argentina, with a lot of countries in South America. Peru had high inflation for many years. they just take the half working system as good enough, right? They focus on the day-to-day survival, and they just take everything as, oh, this is just how things are. And they don't realize how good they could be, right? And I think the role of Bitcoin is, in a country like Argentina, a country like Venezuela, is we need to go in there and tell them, like, actually, hey, no, this is a horrible system. You're getting robbed every single day via inflation. Here's another system you can use that doesn't have any of these, side effects, doesn't have any of these properties of the incumbent system. But again, that takes a lot of time, that takes energy, and the incumbent system, like we said, is very sticky, right? It traps people in it, and for most people, it takes a lot of pain to leave, unfortunately.
With Microseed, you can engrave your 12 or 24 word seed phrase, the entire seed phrase, onto a 1-inch small washer. Yes, just one washer. All 24 words on that one washer. You can hide that thing everywhere. And even better, you don't need to buy a new kit every time you have to get a new wallet. You can make unlimited backups because Microseed is not selling the washer. Microseed is selling the device that stamps the washer. So you get the full kit with the device, with the washers, with the hammer, with everything you need to get started today. And you can make with that unlimited amount of backups. Go now to microseed.io. I finally and officially mine Bitcoin. This is not just something to stack more Satoshis, but it's most importantly also to support the network. Individual miners are the ones that keep the Bitcoin network decentralized. And by the way, you get KYC free Bitcoin. That's why I use Simple Mining. I get an actual proper Bitcoin miner. They set it up for me. They repair it if it breaks down. And most importantly, they let me choose the pool and even connect my own full node. I'm completely sovereign and I'm completely in control, and I can sign up with Ocean, no account needed. I just give them a Bitcoin address and then there's mining going on. No KYC, nothing. So if you're ready to mine Bitcoin, go to simplemining.io, tell them you come from Robin, and let's mine Bitcoin together. You mentioned before we started recording Japan. I think we touched on it, but maybe this was before already. How do you look at that, and why is it interesting for you currently?
Sure. So I look at Japan because I think Japan is one of the most interesting anomalies in global monetary economics and macro in general. Heisenberg Research did a study in 2018 of 55 countries that had gone past 130% debt to GDP in the last 150 years, right? Since 1850. 54 out of those 55 countries had collapsed either by their fiat currency had collapsed either by deflation, Great Depression, hyperinflation, financial repression, so running interest rates really low and running inflation really high, demonetization, so completely changing the monetary standard, or adoption of another currency. So like they adopted the dollar, they adopted the Chinese yuan, like whatever it is, right? Only one country didn't, and that exception is Japan. And Japan has been the exception to many things like that, right? Being the one country above 130% debt to GDP that didn't collapse, being the first country to do QE that didn't see inflation from QE, being the first country to do yield curve control, which is effectively QE infinity, and having it see no effect. They have been what I've termed as the monetary experiment lab for global central banks, right? Whatever central banks do in the West, whatever they do in Europe, they first try in Japan, because Japan is further ahead, not only in demographic decline, but overall, I would say, like, cultural and economic stagnation, right? We've seen this stagnation and this cultural malaise happen in the West, but Japan is about 15 years ahead of us. So, the problem of lower birth rate, of low rates of entrepreneurship, low rates of marriage, all these things were happening in Japan in the early 2000s. And every attempt by the central bankers, every round of QE, they lowered interest rates to zero in 1999 and then into the negative bound. They invented QE in March 2001. They accelerated that in 2008 after the financial crisis. They accelerated it again in 2013. during QQE, again with yield curve control. Really, it's like the central bank's proving ground, right? It's their test lab. And so when I think about like one of the dystopian futures of the West, Japan is one of those options, right? You have a hyperinflationary option where we're dealing with 100% inflation a month. Everyone's trying to ration fuel, ration food. We use other things to barter. We use maybe even use Bitcoin. There's another world where they load everyone up with so much debt, but bring interest rates to the negative bound, let everyone roll their debt forward in perpetuity, and basically zombify and you could say like make comatose the entire economy. So no more entrepreneurship, no more stock market growth, no more real risk taking, but no defaults, right? And so we can live in this kind of twilight zone. And unfortunately, like I'm worried that could be a solution, especially for some European countries that have really declining birth rates. And that's a potential endgame scenario of this like global fiat experiment of the global central banking apparatus.
Super interesting to think about the potential end game for that, as we kind of the theme of the whole podcast now. What is because I want to get a little bit philosophical also. What do you think is the positive effect of Bitcoin creeping in slowly into all our lives? I mean, into both our lives, it's very creeped in already, but in all our society, more people adopting it, more people getting it, more people thinking about it. What do you think is the positive effect of Bitcoin on society just by it getting to be adopted more, being as a store of value and as a mini exchange?
I think there's a lot of positive effects, right? The first is obviously like financial education, right? Like I said earlier, most people are so accustomed to our fiat system. They're the frog boiling in the water. They don't even think that there's alternatives, right? They don't even think like, oh, is 2% inflation actually good for me? And Bitcoin challenges that notion on every level, right? And so it creates a paradigm where you look through the Bitcoin lens, you look through the orange lens, and you see this world around you. And instead of all of it seeming normal, it all seems insane, right? You think, oh, 2% inflation, that's crazy. Why would I do that when I have a store of value? Oh, I have to use a fiat bank and KYC. That's crazy. Why can't I just trade value with you peer to peer without having to have a middleman like I can with Bitcoin? Right? It reframes all economic decisions completely because it offers a completely new lens and a completely new environment in which to operate that decision, right? That's the first thing. The second thing is, I think, culturally, Bitcoin has been making a huge effect on not only the fight for freedom, but also like the universal fight for individual privacy, for individual liberty. Right? You look at people like Ross Ulbricht, which you might have issues with, you might not, but the Bitcoin enabled him to buy and sell drugs on a marketplace, and then he was locked up for that. And then he was, pardoned by Trump, and that was because of the strength of the Bitcoin, the pro Bitcoin community, right? The pro, freedom community that has championed, right, the use of a free asset by free people. And the same is being true of, the Samurai Wallet developer, right? Who was arrested. I forgot his last name. But he was arrested for developing this, peer-to-peer wallet that also operates as a mixer, right? Alleged of money laundering. And for people who care about freedom, right, it gives us a flag to rally around. It gives us a modem with which to fight, with which to resist, right? Because the problem with the other ways of resisting government overreach, government censorship, is you're playing the game by their rules, right? In 2021, GameStop spiked, enormously, right? We had a huge squeeze. A bunch of hedge funds that shorted it started to go underwater, and a bunch of illegal moves were made behind the scenes, like freezing the stock, right? Like not restricting buying of securities, putting certain short sale restrictions on certain counterparties so that they wouldn't get liquidated. We had huge, bailouts happen. Like Melvin Capital got bailed out for like $2.3 billion in January of 2021. And in the wake of that, right, which is part of the reason why I really got into posting online, in the wake of that, there was a huge wave of people that were saying, this system is so broken. How can the stock be shorted over 140% of the float, right? Over 200% of the float. And we realized that the stock market itself, like not only is the money broken, right, but the stock market's broken. So how do you remedy that? Well, let's write letters to the SEC. Let's write comment letters. Let's create proposals. Let's say, hey, these Wall Street banks need to be regulated more, right? Hey, we need to have better oversight of short sale rules, right? But the issue is you're playing the game within, you're trying to play the game by their rules, right? Which is already a tilted field, right? It's an uneven field. They already control all the pieces. They control all the inputs, all the outputs, and your comment letter to the SEC only goes so far, right? In instituting real change. Your decision, right? Like if we didn't have Bitcoin, if somebody was locked up for freedom of speech, right? If Edward Snowden, leaks all these NSA documents about mass surveillance and flees to Russia, how would you support him? You can't. If you try to send him fiat, it's going to get seized. You're going to send him gold. How long is it going to take to get there? Like it could be stolen along the way. Like there's 10,000 things that could happen. There's no real way to support him. And so he would be completely isolated, right? But Bitcoin, instead of us playing the game by their rules, right? Bitcoin gives us a new game we can play, a completely separate system that says, oh no, we don't like, actually, if I want to support Edward Snowden, I can go find his public Bitcoin address and just zap him some sats. I can just send him some stuff, like support him, and he can use that however he wants. That's his choice, right? And it's my choice to do it. And guess what? No government, no board of trustees, no centralized command center, no regulator can stop me from doing that. And the government is actually, in many ways, much weaker than you think, right? There's less than one federal agent for every 1,000 US citizens. And so if people in mass are able to start doing something that is, you could say illegal, right? The cops' ability, the federal government's ability to actually stop that is very, very low. And so what happens in effect is that stops becoming an actual restriction. And Bitcoin's a perfect example of that, right? Bitcoin has already become so widely adopted, especially in America, that it's essentially impossible for them to stop it. Even if they did shut off the on and off ramps right now, which is possible, they could dissuade some, like, let's say fair weather Bitcoiners, but the hardcore Bitcoiners, they wouldn't be worried about that. They already have, cold wallets. They already have, nodes that they're running at home. They have a miner, right? They don't need your exchange. And so everything would happen in a separate fiat system. And so that means that the fight for freedom is much more, you could say, much more viable, right? Because we have this separate system than it otherwise would be.
It's such an important topic because I talk about what we get from Bitcoin, and the obvious first thing is always we get number graph technology, we get the wealth aspect, the economic benefit from it, and the third aspect is like the community, like we're all in this together and all of that. But like the second aspect is actually the most important one, which you kind of talked about, is the freedom aspect. It's that we can transact ourselves, we can verify the nodes, all of those things. And actually, I think the freedom aspect goes really well together with the social aspect, as you just like explained. We care about freedom. We can rally around that one flag, and we can actually move something forward with Bitcoin because we have that one asset that is so important. So when you go to a Bitcoin conference, you don't really feel like you're at the conference of one asset. It's more like a freedom movement. It's more like it's like there are no conferences for a stock. There's no conferences for like any other asset, really. I mean, there are probably gold conferences at some point, like somehow there are conferences for industries, but there's no like conference that compares to what we have in Bitcoin. And that shows you what kind of communities behind that whole behind that whole asset. It's kind of fascinating that we have such a strong community that makes actually an impact even on elections. So it's a nice thing to recognize Bitcoin's power for freedom and for social change in our political system already now, even though it's just a $1-2 trillion asset, which is like still very early, and we already have impact, we already have merchants, we already have all those things.
Yeah, exactly. I think we're still in the early innings of Bitcoin. And again, the biggest challenge we face is actually getting the awareness, the adoption, up. I did a study last fall on the digital euro, and I made a whole YouTube video about it. Actually, it was the first YouTube video on my new channel. And that YouTube video, like doing the research for it, was so fascinating because the digital euro, right, is lauded as this, decentralized currency that is issued by the central bank, but is like somehow run by like 50 different nodes. So it's like decentralized, and all those nodes, interact with each other. And so you can go to a node and deposit euros, and then they will issue you these digital euros, and then you can use to buy and sell, and it'll be seamless. It'll be better than cash, right? They give you all these benefits, but what they don't tell you is that obviously embedded into their architecture are plans for mass surveillance, for digital ID tracking, for product ID tracking. So like, let's say you go, you're in Switzerland, and where Switzerland's legal to buy a gun, but let's say you have an unpaid parking ticket. You go to buy a gun and they say, nope, can't buy a gun. You have an unpaid parking ticket. Or, oh, nope, you got in trouble in England for, free speech. You tweeted something mean, and we don't like that. So you can't exercise your rights. You can't buy food next to a protest because of that. You can't buy, let's say like, clothes this winter. Sorry. This is how it works, right? That architecture is built in to the very fabric of the digital euro, right? Even though it's not explicit, it's in their architecture documents. The reason why that's scary is because in a world where there's no scenario, most people would be forced into that, right? In a world where there's no alternative, most people will be forced into that. When a world where Bitcoin exists, suddenly we have an alternative, and we can go and tell people like, hey, if and when they do roll this out, you don't have to actually take it. You don't have to accept it. You can accept Bitcoin. You can do something else, right? And actually, your purchase of Bitcoin, your buying and selling a Bitcoin is permissionless. And so even if, like, let's say they shut down the exchanges, we can show you other ways to buy Bitcoin that aren't on exchanges, right? That aren't through a centralized custodian, that are peer-to-peer. And that will allow you to retain your wealth, retain your purchasing power, and fight back against the very government that is trying to oppress you, right? Because again, all of their power rests on the illusion that they are omnipotent, right? Everyone needs to believe how strong they are. The minute that a significant portion of the population starts rebelling is the minute that their whole house of cards starts to collapse. I mean, you look at the American Revolution, right? There's a meme that the American Revolution is basically fought by the majority of Americans. That's not true. The actual percentage of American people who fought like in battles for America's independence is 3%. 3%. 3% of the population stood up and said, we don't want to be a British colony. And the Brits fought those 3% and they lost. And then they had to leave because the cost is too high, right? They don't have enough soldiers. They don't have money. They don't have enough medical personnel, right? It like you lose enough battles, and the British government was like, okay, we could raise another 100 regiments and fight them. But it's like, what's the worth of it? They want to be free. We'll let them be free, right? The same is true of many like asymmetric warfare scenarios, right? Whether you're talking about, Northern Ireland, the Troubles, whether you're talking about Vietnam, or you're talking about Afghanistan, right? You don't need a huge portion of the population to actually rebel in a huge manner in order for the system to start breaking. And so you can think about like the digital euro. Let's say 20% of that population, 30% especially the high income earners, right? The successful people, the people who work hard for their money. They just say, no, I'm not doing this. I'm not paying your taxes. What are you going to do? You're going to arrest all of us? You're going to arrest 30% of the population? Where are you going to put us? They can't. So they'll fold, right? They have to. And that's what Bitcoin allows us the opportunity to do. It gives us that asymmetric option where we can say, hey, we don't need to get 90% of the population on our side. We don't need 100% of the population. We need 5 or 10%. We need the top business owners. We need, the people who run, huge parts of the economy to jump on our side. We need the energy industry. We get the European energy industry to use Bitcoin and say no to the digital euro. What are the governments going to do? Okay, well, we'll arrest all of you. Okay, then you don't have energy. Good luck. Have fun. Have fun living in the Stone Age, right? Very quickly, their power dissipates. So they rely on you being afraid of them and by thinking you have no options. And Bitcoin gives you the option to opt out.
I love that. You you remind me of Jeff Booth when you're talking. I don't know if you probably listen also to a lot of his stuff, but like he's great. I just recorded with him in Prague, and it's always refreshing to hear, because you have all those like these fiat things, and then this guy comes in and says like, all doesn't matter. There's Bitcoin. It's a new system. They all have to go there. And I'm like, yeah, that makes sense. But it's so hard to like see that reality, because it's also so feared in our world. It's good and refreshing that we have people like you, Jeff Booth, and many others that understand the new system and how powerful Bitcoin really is.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate it. It's taken me a while to get to this mentality, but I think it's the proper one, because it's too easy to be a complete doomer, right? It's too easy to be like, oh, everything is screwed. Bitcoin's never going to win. We're all going to be taxed to death, right? We're all fiat slaves for the rest of our lives. They're going to inflate the dollar away, and I'm going to die poor, destitute, and homeless in a ditch, right? It's too easy to fall down that rabbit hole. But that's not true. There are options. There are ways to fight back. And again, we don't need a huge portion of the population. We need a small, committed, very strong-willed subset, and we can change the world. And so we get enough of us to stop paying taxes. We get enough of us to say no to censorship. We get enough of us to, whatever the issue is, the pro-freedom issue, and the world has to accommodate us. So, yeah, and we have the tool to do it, which is Bitcoin.
Really cool. Thank you so much. We have one question that I asked each and every one of my new guests on the podcast, and you have been not the first time on the podcast. And the question is, what can we learn from you besides Bitcoin?
What can you learn from me besides Bitcoin? Well, I would normally say macro, right? But I think that's too that's too formulaic. That's too basic. I already talk about macro a lot. I would honestly talk about the, like, something I've mentioned on a couple podcasts is like the spiritual nature of what we do, right? I believe good and evil exists, right? I'm a Christian. I believe in angels and demons. I believe in absolute good, absolute evil. And I obviously exist that I believe that humans are on a spectrum between that, right? We're partially good, partially evil. And the choices we make in this life lead to better things for the world or worse things for the world, right? And Bitcoin, in that sense, to me, is a spiritual war, because it represents a resistance against a tyranny that is intent on stealing and siphoning life force from people, right? Because the way that most people earn money, the way that actually an economy works, is that people do things for other people, and they earn money for that. And if the central government can print money, central bank can print money and devalue everyone's currency, what they're essentially doing is devaluing your life. They're stealing your life. They're taking away years that you could have had, years of freedom, years of abundance, years of, spending time and energy with family and friends, with taking care of your parents, with, traveling the world, with learning new things, with starting a new business, whatever it is. They're stealing that from you every day. And I can't think of a more evil and pernicious thing than that. And the worst part is they use the money they get from that to fund wars and to fund, fiat food and to fund corporate bailouts and, handouts for their cronies and corrupt prison system, right? Corrupt legal system. It's all a war of good and evil, taking advantage of people and exploiting them and hurting them versus helping them and uplifting them. And so in that lens, I view what I do, but also what Bitcoin is, as a spiritual war. As this is good versus evil, guys. This is why we need to take it seriously. This is not just number go up. This isn't just, yay, we can make Bitcoin's 120K. Yes, I can take out a loan for 5% and then gamble it on some more Bitcoin. Let's go. No, this is good and evil. This is the future of humanity decided here, right? What kind of world do we want to leave for our kids? What kind of world do we want to leave for those that come after us? A better world. So why don't we fight for that, right? And actually take a stand and not back down. So that's what I think. I think this war is much more spiritual than most people think, and we need to be strong and courageous and steadfast in what we do.
Really cool. I love that. Really, really nice. We have a end routine in the podcast where the previous guest is asking a question for the next guest without knowing who the next guest actually is. And he asked you a really interesting one. If you could be the president of the United States with no limits and no consequences, so whatever you do, you don't get bad press, your parliament members will love you anyways, no matter what you do. So like you have no limitations, no consequences. What would be the three main things that you would do?
Three main things. Okay. I think that's, like I said, that's pretty easy. One, is get rid of the Fed. Complete elimination of the Federal Reserve. And go back to hard money. So Bitcoin standard, right? Universalization of Lightning wallets, and everyone uses Bitcoin. And we don't care if other countries use fiat. We're going to use Bitcoin. That's what we're going to do. So that'd be number one. Number two, I would, I know this might sound controversial for some people, I would legalize most drugs. So, but I would have a caveat is I would say you legalize, I think marijuana should be universally legalized. I would legalize even like heroin and fentanyl and things like that. But you have restricted areas in which you can use them. So like, let's say you're an addict. Let's say you're homeless. You can't use fentanyl on the street. You can't use heroin on the street. We would send you to a facility. You'd be cared for, and if you wanted to, work in the facility and earn money and then use it to buy drugs and use it in a supervised way, we'd allow you to do that, because we don't want you to be, using dangerous drugs, dying on the street, giving money to drug dealers who will use it to hurt and kill people. We don't want that, right? We'd rather have it all regulated, and this is what Portugal did in the 2000s, and it actually halved their opioid overdoses and addiction rate in the space of like 10 years. So this system works, right? You legalize it, but you control it. That'd be the second thing. The third thing, this is kind of hard. There's so many things that you could do other than just like fixing the money. Oh, well, this one's easy. We need to reform the entire health system. And because I think a lot of our problems that exist now politically are actually downstream of people's mental health issues and physical health issues. So I would ban seed oils. I would ban high fructose corn syrup. I would outright ban like most food dyes. I would put limits on manufacturers, say you can only have, 5 or 6 ingredients in cereal. You can only have 3 ingredients in soda. Like I don't understand why they need, the US, the American made Fruit Loops has 40 ingredients. That is insane, right? So I would ban all that. And then on the positive side is I would encourage much more red meat consumption, butter, right? Healthy fruits and vegetables. Basically retool our entire agricultural system to be pro-farmer, pro-regenerative agriculture, right? And pro-whole foods. And make sure that the tax system was incentivized in that way so that people who wanted to start a farm could start a farm, pay very little taxes if they're creating good food for people, and sell it at a good rate and earn a living doing that. So those would be the 3 things I would do.
I like that. I like that a lot. The only question, but there's no consequences, so no limitations. But you would probably have to do a fourth thing where you have to cut all government spending in like to like 1/10 because you no longer have the Fed to support it all.
No,
Yeah.
absolutely. That's part of the first plan. And trust me, I would. In a lot of people would not be happy with my presidency, but I would gut so much stuff. I know it sounds controversial, but I'm very, very libertarian. I would cut us down to probably where the federal government was in 1890. So, I mean, in that world, there's like basically just like the post office, the legal system, and the military. That's it. No government grants, no government Department of Education, no Department of Agriculture. Again, I think you could maybe make an argument for those things to exist on like skeleton crews, but basically half of the departments, half of the 3-letter agencies would just be axed by me. Like they'd be dead. So fire everybody, send them all home, and let's run everything, very light so people can just get back to living their life.
I see the, how's he called? Chiavenale with the axe let's cut it all down. I would love to see you going through the White House like that. Really cool. Thank you so much, Roberto, for being on. Before I let you go, where can people find you, ask you questions, and reach out to you?
Absolutely. I'm on Twitter at Peruvian_bull, or if you just look up Roberto Rios. I have a Substack also, which is called $Endgame. If you want to follow more macro writing and discussion of like what's happening in Japan, what's happening in the US, what's happening with the Fed. And then I also have obviously a YouTube channel called Peruvian Bull, and that's BULL. That's on YouTube. You can go find me. I'm doing finance macro content there. So all the links should be in my link tree on Twitter. And so if you find that, you'll be able to find everything I have. I also have a book, $Endgame, which is on Amazon. So you can look that up and purchase it if you want to.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Roberto, for being on the podcast. Also, thank you so much for everyone that is watching and listening, for joining us today. As always, I'll be back. This content is for educational and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute financial advice.